think many people have consumed a lot of this misinformation, disinformation, and I really believe it's incumbent upon all of us as members of Parliament to combat this and to not lose sight of the fact that our dialogue and debates are supposed to be anchored in the pursuit of truth. And that if democracy loses sight of that, I think we're in big trouble. And I think that's what we're seeing today, is that people are misinformed. I looked at and heard all of the news coverage, live news coverage on Friday. I watched it all day, and I couldn't help but notice and be.
We have to allow other questions. The honourable member for York Simcoe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Whitby. And, I too, probably like him, had thousands of Canadians standing on the overpasses as the convoys move through. And I thank him that, we shouldn't be looking at those struggling as our adversaries. And we should be looking to mutual respect and sometime a little compromise. But we know it was the flip-flop on the mandates for the truckers that sparked this. And I would ask my colleague, I've looked for the science behind this. We have 90% vaccination rate. I wonder if he's seen the science behind, before the mandates were in, because they've operated without a mandate for 2 years, and now the mandates are in, that they're justified at this point in the pandemic. And I even watched Transport Committee. The honourable member for Thornhill asked the Transport Minister this. He couldn't answer that, and I know we follow the science. So I just wonder, there is a carve out. We're allowing truckers to deliver vaccines right now across the border without the mandate. So I'm wondering the scientific justification for the mandates now.
The honourable member for Whitby.
Thank you to my honourable colleague for asking me a great question. So from what I understand, Omicron changed the whole scenario that we're in. So the context has shifted, but that doesn't undermine the effectiveness of our vaccines in significantly reducing hospitalization, severe illness, and outcomes like mortality or death. And so vaccine mandates are still effective in reducing the spread of COVID-19 and specifically the spread of severe outcomes and alleviating the burden on our healthcare systems, which we saw in the Omicron wave come very close to breaking down completely. I think we've got to continue this fight. The higher the vaccination rates, the better. And vaccine mandates have been proven in many jurisdictions to push those vaccination rates up as high as possible, which is good for our country and good for our economy. I fully believe that every Canadian should choose for themselves to get vaccinated. And if they don't choose to do so, that's their choice. But there's going to be some consequences associated with that.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton with Tascoin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, a year ago this week, I made a 1-minute statement in the virtual House of Commons from my basement in Edmonton. I've reflected on that statement a lot over the past few weeks, and yesterday as I listened to the debate and monitored my very active and animated social media feeds, I decided to work that statement into my speech this morning, if for no other reason than to anchor my own thoughts and emotions. Here's what I said a year ago. This past several years have been challenging for global democracy. We've seen a rise in polarization and increasingly vitriolic language expressed by hyper-partisans from all sides. Too often, this leads to violence. Social media has exacerbated the problem. Sides are chosen and anchored in Twitter biographies. Talking points are delivered in echo chambers amplified by cryptic algorithms. 6 decades ago, President Dwight Eisenhower seemingly anticipated our current need for wisdom, saying, "The middle of the road is all of the usable surface. The extremes, right and left, are in the gutters." Before our political labels, we are all human beings. The middle of the road is simply our common ground. Make no mistake, passionate political debate is foundational to a healthy democracy, but it's most effective when we engage in conversations, not only seeking to persuade, but open to being persuaded. This will require a significant shift in our current thinking, but in the end, we'll all be better for it. Now, I'll let others wade into the speeches and comments from this debate to discern who's adding to the polarization and vitriol and who's working to de-escalate them, apart from singling out one colleague. The speech from the new member from Simcoe North was the highlight of my day yesterday. His was a firm assessment. He was fair with his words and respectful in his tone, a worthy successor to the wonderful man who preceded him, Bruce Stanton. Madam Speaker, the other day I had several conversations with members of my amazing team. They're being absolutely deluged with calls and emails from constituents concerned about the Prime Minister's use of the Emergencies Act, and they wanted me to post something on social media that they could point people to, clearly stating my position. So in about a minute, as I walked from this chamber down to the street, I simply wrote, I've received more calls and emails in opposition to the Prime Minister's Emergencies Act than perhaps any issue I've seen in 16 years. I agree with my constituents on this. It's a massive liberal overreach, a dangerous precedent, and I will be speaking and voting against it, unquote. After that post, many rightfully asked what I would have done, a reasonable and fair question. Before I get into that, though, I want to make some observations. During the debate yesterday, it was very clear that each of the two parties supporting the use of the Emergencies Act is taking a very different communications strategy. The Liberals have used the argument that the measures have been effective at clearing out Ottawa's downtown core, as though that is the sole determinant as to the rightness of the decision to employ the Emergencies Act. Of course, there was never any question as to whether the measures would be effective. If they weren't, we'd have much bigger issues than we're dealing with here today. The question we need to ask is whether the invocation of the Emergencies Act is justified. The Prime Minister himself has said that it shouldn't be the first, second, or third response, but so far no Liberal has been able to say what the first, second, or third response was before using an act that hasn't been used in its 34 years of existence. NDP members in this debate have had an even more difficult time, having completely abandoned long-held NDP positions and principles. They've adopted a sort of scorched earth approach to the debate, repeatedly highlighting a number of individual actions and situations that every member of this House agrees are completely unacceptable, and then attempting to attach those unacceptable actions to the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are demanding that their legitimate concerns be heard by their government. If you want to understand the traditional NDP position, you'd be best to visit the Canadian Civil Liberties Association website, because you won't hear any NDP members actually talking about it here. Returning to my response to those who ask me what I'd have done in this situation, first, what they need to recognize is that just in the case of any protest movement since the beginning of time, there are those who will use the movement to pile on their own issues and agenda. I'm going to deal with the core issue, which is federal vaccine mandates. For starters, I'd have followed the May 2021 principle laid out by the Prime Minister himself, who said in an interview, quote, "We're not a country that makes vaccines mandatory," unquote. He and I are both pro-vaccine, and at the time, we're both anti-mandate. We wouldn't be where we are today if he hadn't changed that during the election campaign. It made for a fantastic political wedge. I've never seen a more angry, divided electorate in my 6 campaigns. The Liberal campaign was invigorated by the issue, but it was a terribly divisive policy. That's right. Terribly divisive. Our Conservative campaign position was a good one: no federal mandate and stronger testing. We expressed a belief in vaccine science and offered an alternative for those who weren't there yet. But in the volatile last 3 campaign weeks, that rational message just didn't cut through. Here's the critical part. In order to comprehend where we are today, you might have to really work to put yourself in the position of someone who may have a view significantly different than yours. This is increasingly rare in a world obsessed with othering. Now, I'm solidly pro-vaccine. I have my 3 Pfizer shots. I believe in the evidence I've been presented, while also believing that we need to remain vigilant for emerging information. People I know and love have come to a completely different conclusion regarding the efficacy of vaccines. While I strongly disagree with them on vaccine efficacy, I support their right not to take them. We can't be a country that forces people to inject themselves with things they believe will hurt them, whether we agree or not. Last May, the Prime Minister seemed to also hold that view. People will say, we're not forcing anybody, they have a choice. This thinking is easy to get past with just a little personal reflection. Of course, we all have things we believe rightly or wrongly will hurt us. Most of us haven't ever been told we will lose our careers over them. Everybody's hurting right now because of COVID. The last 2 years have been tough, but there's a portion of the population who because they won't take a vaccine that they genuinely believe will hurt them, have been forced out of their jobs and in some cases their homes. Whatever the percentage, the number of unvaccinated Canadians is not insignificant. Their intense, genuine frustration is completely understandable for anyone that takes the time to listen to their stories. You can have empathy without agreeing with their views on vaccines. Our Prime Minister could have tasked medical experts to persuade or most safely accommodate people with quote-unquote deep convictions, using the Prime Minister's own May 2021 words, people he or they were unable to convince to take vaccines. If we're actually all in this together, then this is what he would have done. Instead of a strategy focused on real togetherness, though, the Prime Minister chose not only to exclude people who hold a different belief on vaccines than he does, and I share for that matter, he has consistently and deliberately demonized them for holding that belief. Leaving aside the Prime Minister's most inflammatory attacks, remarks saying many of them are misogynist and racist, let's zero in on the near constant reference to unvaccinated Canadians as selfish. As a mass characterization, this is simply untrue. Some of the most generous people I know have chosen to be unvaccinated. Sure, most believe vaccines will hurt them on an individual level. That doesn't make them selfish. They also believe nobody should take them because they believe they'll hurt us and they care about us. The bottom line is this: on Monday, Parliament voted on a nonpartisan Conservative motion designed to de-escalate the situation. Conservatives also reiterated clearly that the illegal blockades need to end, and that plan was rejected by Liberal and NDP members. Instead, the Emergencies Plan was announced. While Liberal MPs are correct in pointing out that police have been effective in clearing the streets, surely we can agree that absolutely nothing has been done to address the legitimate concerns of the vast majority of people who supported this protest from across the country. If anything, those Canadians feel less heard and more abandoned by their government than they did four weeks ago. We are more divided today as a country than at any time in our history. To close, Madam Speaker, I'd like to say this in response to the mass branding project undertaken over the past few weeks by too many, not all, but too many members of the Liberals and New Democrats, and to be clear, a strategy too often used by members from all parties at times. Now, and in the future, no matter what might be the issue of the day, no matter what is being protested on and around Parliament Hill, I will never be afraid to talk to people I've never met, fearful that someone in the background that I don't know might hold up a sign that anyone who knows me knows that I would find abhorrent. I will never be afraid to have a meaningful conversation with a fellow human being because of some label that someone in this House or their partisan friends will attach to me for solely partisan political reasons. Madam Speaker, if that is something we can all agree on as we find some time to breathe and reflect this week, perhaps that will be a starting point for real, powerful change in this country. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Outremer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech and mention off of the top that I too have had several conversations with several protesters, and I think it's important to have those conversations. My question to him stems from his comment regarding the fact that our government did not proceed with any actions prior to the invocation of the Emergency Measures Act, which is completely incorrect. We did provide our CMP at the request of provinces and territories on every occasion. And in fact, following that, the government of Alberta sent a letter to our federal government, and I will read quickly into the record a portion of that letter. I quote, "The RCMP, along with local provincial officials, have been working closely in an attempt to persuade the demonstration participants to remove their vehicles, but have been unsuccessful. In addition, as a result of private industry concerns over negative consequences, the RCMP have been unable to secure the appropriate heavy-duty equipment required to remove vehicles and other items such as trailers and tractors from the area. Attempts to procure these services with..."
Honourable Member to ask a question, please, because we have to give other up.
Madam Speaker, I would like to ask the member opposite from Alberta why he is denying the people of Alberta the protections that the government of his province have requested from the federal government.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Wetaskiwin.
Well, Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I want to commend the honourable member. It might be the first time that I've heard a Liberal member mention Alberta in the House, actually.
Exactly.
And, you know, she has to recognize, first of all, my constituents are almost universally the feedback we've got has been opposed to the Emergencies Act. I would say probably my staff tell me 95% of the feedback we've got has been people asking me to oppose the Emergencies Act. I would welcome any Liberal member of Parliament who wants to come out to Canada's most populous riding, Edmonton-Wetaskiwin. I would gladly give them a tour so they can actually talk to some of the people that they too often completely ignore.
Et commentaires, l'honorable député d'Avignon.
The honourable member for Avignon. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I really appreciated it, and it's true that it's regrettable that this has become a discussion that's dividing families along the lines of whether they're for or against vaccination. And with all due respect, I know that the Conservatives they flip-flopped on whether or not they supported the demonstrators. And some Conservatives on social media have been launching a misinformation campaign saying that they had a plan to lift public health restrictions. Doesn't the member think that that also contributes to the division and exacerbates the problem? The honourable member was.
To be clear, Conservatives have been unequivocal in denouncing clearly negative aspects of what happened outside this place, while at the same time being clearly supporting individuals from across the country who have legitimate concerns about the approach the government's taking. In regards to the plan the honourable member mentioned, I would point out that her party supported the plan. We appreciate that because last Monday we did have a chance to move forward. It was a simple ask of the government to put forward a plan on February 28th, 2 weeks after that date, 1 week from tomorrow, that would have laid out where we plan to go with COVID, something that governments around the world are doing, and something that would have definitely had an impact on many of the people who were protesting both here in Ottawa and across the country.
The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, the honourable member tried to walk a very fine line in presenting this caring and compassionate middle ground, and he stated that he would never be afraid to speak to people because of some label. Perhaps it's because he's never felt the existential threat of white supremacy. So how does this honourable member reconcile his attempts for this moderate position while he totally disregards the very real threat of violent white supremacy that is caused to communities that it targets with vile hatred and violence?
Honourable member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Let me be 100% clear. This party, every member on this side of the House, is 100% against the issues that he's talking about, against violent white supremacy of any kind, racial bigotry of any kind, and other bigotry of any kind. What I actually said was, I won't be afraid to have conversations with people I don't know as I'm walking from my apartment to the House of Commons, because I'm afraid of a label that the opposition, that NDP members, particularly in this House, want to attach to me for partisan political reasons.
In debate, the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The motion before us is a story of a profound failure of leadership. When I was elected to this chamber some 16 years ago and became the Member of Parliament for Abbotsford, I wouldn't have believed you had you told me that I would be asked to approve giving this Prime Minister the extraordinary powers of the Emergencies Act. I remember when, growing up as a teenager in 1970, Pierre Elliott Trudeau triggered the War Measures Act to quell the FLQ terrorist threat in Quebec. That crisis had gripped the nation for many months and involved kidnappings, extortion, over 200 bombings, gun violence, robbery, and the eventual murder of a Quebec cabinet minister. The circumstances were clear and compelling, implicating the security and sovereignty of our country and justifying the use of this extreme measure. Fast forward to today, and the circumstances are very different. For 2 years, truck drivers had been the heroes of the COVID pandemic, risking their health to transport goods and groceries as the virus raged across our nation. For a while, they, the truckers, were the good guys. And then our Prime Minister decided to deprive these heroes of their livelihoods because they chose not to get vaccinated, despite the Prime Minister failing to show any evidence that unvaccinated truckers were significant spreaders of the virus. And he made no effort to accommodate these Canadians through the use of other tools like PCR or rapid tests. The reaction of the truckers was swift. A convoy was organized with the goal of delivering to the Prime Minister one simple message: do not force us truckers to get vaccinated in order to keep our jobs. And we all know the rest of the story. The protests grew and ended up right here in Ottawa, camped out in front of the Parliament buildings. And they were expecting, at the very least, that their Prime Minister would be open to listening to their concerns. But they were wrong. He wasn't. It became clear that the Prime Minister wasn't interested in hearing out his own citizens. What he did do was resort to name-calling. The protesters were the fringes of Canadian society. They were misogynists, they were racist, they were science deniers, they were un-Canadian. Do we even tolerate these people, he screamed. In fact, he questioned whether those people should have any place in his Canada. In the meantime, residents of downtown Ottawa were rightly becoming agitated. Incessant honking of horns, shops and malls that had to close their doors and send employees home, major traffic disruptions, and misbehavior by a small number of protesters. Life in the protest zone was becoming unbearable. I know, my apartment is within that protest zone. So we Conservatives called upon the protesters to dismantle the barricades and for the Prime Minister to reach out to the truckers. He again refused, not even in Olive Branch. Instead, during the first week of the protest, the Prime Minister simply disappeared into his cottage, missing in action as a crisis developed. And when he finally reappeared, we Conservatives began asking him what steps he was taking to resolve the impasse. After all, he himself had said that invoking the Emergencies Act should not be the first or second or even the third response. So we asked him, what was his first or second or third response? Had he met with the protesters? Would he sit down with the other party leaders to discuss a resolution to the dispute? Had he deployed a negotiating team to resolve the impasse? Had he delivered the additional policing resources so desperately needed by the City of Ottawa? We were met with stony silence. The answer was obviously no. The Prime Minister hadn't taken any steps to address this evolving situation. He even rejected our request to create a plan to roll back mandates, which could have lowered the temperature. For 3 long weeks, the Prime Minister refused to act. And then he did what only autocrats and authoritarian regimes do when faced with peaceful civil disobedience. He did what his father had done in 1970. He triggered Canada's war measures regime. Except this time, the circumstances did not in any way rise to the level of those present during the FLQ crisis. There have been no bombings in the streets of Ottawa, no kidnappings, no robberies, no extortion or gun violence, no murders of politicians. Only peaceful civil disobedience by frustrated Canadians who've concluded that the Prime Minister doesn't care for them. Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister had at his disposal all of the tools he needed to bring an end to this protest without invoking Canada's war measures legislation. Indeed, blockades at the Ambassador Bridge and at the Coots border crossing and in Emerson, Manitoba, have all been resolved without resorting to the Emergencies Act. And what about the violent rail blockades in 2020, the Oka standoff, or the Wet'suwet'en dispute in BC? What about the riots in Toronto at the G7 in 2010? The Emergencies Act wasn't required. Not even the circumstances around 9/11 called for war measures legislation. The Prime Minister already has the tools to respond to the Ottawa protest. It's just that he chose not to use them. There was no need to freeze the bank accounts of Canadians for exercising their right to peaceful protest or for donating to the cause. There was no need for this Liberal government to suspend the licenses and livelihoods of truckers without due process, simply because they disagreed with his vaccine mandates. Completely unnecessary and a reckless overreach by this power-hungry Prime Minister. By triggering extraordinary, sweeping powers under the Emergencies Act, this Prime Minister has set an incredibly low bar for abrogating the rights and freedoms of the Canadians. And how do we know that? Well, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is challenging the Prime Minister's power grab in court. Here's what they had to say, and I quote, "The federal government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act. This law creates a high and clear standard for good reason. The Act allows government to bypass ordinary democratic processes. This standard has not been met. The Emergencies Act is there to address extreme threats to Canada, not to protect the economy, as the Prime Minister had suggested. Emergency legislation should not be normalized. It threatens our democracy and our civil liberties." End quote. That's the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Never before in the history of our country has the threshold for triggering this martial law been so low and the overreach been so high as with the motion before us. When the story of this monumental overreach and abuse of power is finally written, and when historians analyze and dissect why this Prime Minister would invoke martial law powers to quell peaceful civil disobedience, when historians try to explain why Canada's Prime Minister chose to use a constitutional sledgehammer to crack a peanut, as the NDP's Tommy Douglas once put it, I want to be on the right side of that history. I want my children and my 12 grandchildren and their descendants to know that I stood on the side of freedom, that I stood up to a power-grabbing Prime Minister. And yes, the streets of downtown Ottawa are now clear. Protesters are in jail, truckers are on their way home, bank accounts have been frozen, and the lives of many Canadians have been irrevocably damaged by the Prime Minister's failure to listen and his abuse of the Emergencies Act. But for what? I say to the Prime Minister, how did it come to this? This was a mess of his own making. The Prime Minister could have listened and de-escalated. He had the tools to resolve the situation, but he refused. And that is a profound failure of leadership on his part. Invoking the Emergencies Act is and was completely unnecessary and sets an extremely dangerous and ugly precedent for the future. For all of those reasons, Madam Speaker, I will be voting against this motion.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague and friend for his very passionate speech. I, like him, believe in peaceful protest. I, like him, believe that we should try to de-escalate when possible. I've participated in peaceful protests before, and if I ever attended one where others showed up who detracted from my message, in fact, damaged my ability to deliver that message, I would leave. And that's what we've seen in the past weeks in Ottawa. So, and they didn't leave, because I don't paint everybody with the same brush. There were peaceful protesters out there with a message. So my question to him is, Why do you think they didn't leave? And if he was in that circumstances, would he do the same and leave so his message is not damaged?
Member for Abbotsford.
Well, Madam Speaker, I thank the member for his excellent question. And I thank him for not painting everybody with the same brush, as some of his Liberal colleagues and the NDP do. That's to his credit. But I will say this to him. Because I live within the protest zone, and every single day I walk to and from work through the protesters, I can tell him from experience, I never felt intimidated. I was never accosted. Yes, there were some people speaking loudly, some with strong views. But did it take the Emergencies Act, the sledgehammer of war measures type legislation, to resolve this? No. The Prime Minister had all those tools available to him to resolve this crisis. He chose not to. And that is to his discredit. That is his failure and his alone.
The honourable member for La Pointe de l'Île. Yes, Madam Speaker, I would like to know, we've seen the Ottawa Police Service ask for help for 1,800 additional police officers, but the federal government only sent a handful. How does the honourable member explain that? The honourable member for Abbotsford.
I can't explain it, Madam Speaker. I'm as befuddled as he is. The Prime Minister says, oh, I needed this Emergencies Act legislation because I didn't have the tools. And yet the simple tools of providing resources to the Ottawa Police, those resources were never delivered by the Prime Minister, as this member has suggested. There was a better way of resolving.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
I would like to thank the member for Abbotsford. This is not just about the Prime Minister's failures. It is about a lot more. It is not just about peaceful disobedience. Questions have been raised about whether other tools could have been used instead of the Emergencies Act. I want to remind the member that in Ottawa, there was a court-ordered injunction. While the extremists complied for a short term, they proceeded to ignore this legal instrument. Indeed, municipal and provincial state of emergency declarations did not effect the physical entrenchment for the remaining time. Do the Conservatives not view this situation as an emergency? Indeed, a national emergency to prevent more Canadians from being infiltrated from the extremist ideologies.
The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Madam Speaker, I thank the member for that question. I believe she and I have a very different perspective on what may have happened with the injunction against the truckers using their horns. Because remember, I live in the middle of that protest zone. The trucks are right outside my doorway. And when that injunction was issued, the truckers, for the most part, did comply with that injunction. I think anybody who would have walked through that area post-injunction would affirm my version of the events. Now, does this have anything to do with racism? I would just say to her, listen, when this convoy started out, when this protest started, it was about vaccine mandates being compelled by this Prime Minister. It is this Prime Minister's mess. But what happened, of course, like many protests, they evolve. And they're like magnets, and they attract people who may not be desirable, who hold views that are very antithetical to Canadian values. And we disavow those views. We have said that clearly.
And we have to resume debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Great to see you this morning. Great to be here with colleagues. I'll let you know at the outset that I'll be splitting my time with the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore. Colleagues, we've reached a critical point, a fork in the road, if you like, in the history of Canadian democracy. I think that needs to be acknowledged. There is no Canadian exceptionalism. If there isn't any American exceptionalism, we know that that is one of the founding myths of the United States in terms of its democracy. It's also true that it's a founding myth of this country, but I think that myth has been exposed. There is nothing inevitable about Canadian democracy. There's nothing guaranteed about it. The past few weeks have shown that. At the outset, let me, before going into my remarks, Madam Chair, thank law enforcement here on the Hill, the Parliamentary Protective Service for all the work that they have done to ensure our security. Also law enforcement, all law enforcement, but especially in Ottawa, those who have traveled from London. And they have. They've been here, they've been in Windsor in recent weeks, and I deeply thank them for their service. The Emergencies Act is an extraordinary measure, it is true. Introduced in 1988, it has never been used. I heard my colleague opposite, who I have great respect for, we served on the Finance Committee together for a time, but I have to take issue with many of his remarks, especially when he said that the Emergencies Act confers onto the government martial law powers. Yeah. Martial law powers, that's an extraordinary way to look at it. It's also the wrong way to look at it, because as we know, and as the government has made clear, the Emergencies Act is subject to the Charter, it is time limited, and it is geographically focused. On top of that, and I was also interested that I have not heard very much from the Conservative Party on this, that the Act itself was introduced by a progressive Conservative government in 1988 under Prime Minister Mulroney and under Defence Minister Perrin Beatty. The debates on that Act, they're very interesting to go back into the Hansard and look at. Time and again it was emphasized by that Conservative government that the Charter is sacrosanct. There was an attempt at that time to ensure that the infringements of civil liberties that had taken place under the War Measures Act in World War I, in World War II, and in the October crisis of 1970 would not be repeated. And so when I hear my colleagues talk about the Emergencies Act in the way that they do, they talk about it as martial law, they talk about it as war measures. There's nothing to that. So let's at least agree. If we're going to disagree, that's fine. But let's at least agree on a shared set of facts in order to have a meaningful discussion. For the purposes of the Act, I remind my colleagues, if they haven't read the Act itself, it sounds like they haven't on the opposite side, unfortunately, that under the Act, a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that, first of all, seriously endangers the lives, health or safety of Canadians, and it is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it. Let's break that down to see if that first condition has been met. Health and safety, the health and safety of Canadians. Well, for the residents of Ottawa, life has been completely upended in the past few weeks. Seniors unable to go get groceries. Families unable to take their kids to school. People unable to get to work, among other challenges, deep challenges, Madam Speaker. This is a crisis. Challenge doesn't even begin to describe what the people of Ottawa have faced. On top of that, the capacity of authority of provinces to deal with it. Well, we heard yesterday very clearly from Ottawa's police chief, Steve Bell, who made very clear that the Emergencies Act has been instrumental in the success that police have made over the past couple of days in terms of putting the convoy and everything that it represents, in terms of dealing with that challenge, in terms of pushing it back. On top of that, we have the Association of Chiefs of Police of Canada, who have come out very strongly and agreed with the government's position on invoking the Emergencies Act. The Mayor of Ottawa made clear time and again that his government lacked the resources to deal with the crisis. The Premier of Ontario has made the same comment. The Premier of Ontario, a Conservative Premier, has been very clear that he agrees with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So under the Act, I believe that Section A, in terms of the definition of what an emergency constitutes, has been met. Section B talks about, and I quote, an emergency is when there is a serious threat to the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of the country. Well, we've seen, Madam Chair, we've seen several border point crossings blockaded over many days. And what are borders about? They're about many things. These vital crossings ensure economic security for our country. They ensure jobs for people. When they were blockaded, people couldn't get to work because they had been temporarily laid off. But more than that, I think we have to understand borders in terms of sovereignty and security. A country that is unable to control its borders because of a blockade has a threat to its sovereignty in place, a threat to its security in place, and to that of its people. And so for that reason, Madam Chair, I believe condition B has been met. The government has elaborated, and in the Act, there's various ways an emergency is understood. What we have in front of us is a public order emergency. And in the Act, that is defined as, and I quote, activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of a threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state. It's that latter part that's crucial. Achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective. The convoy had as one of its principal motives, or at least its organizers did, as one of its principal motives, the overthrow of a democratically elected government. This was their ideological objective, Madam Speaker. And so, for that reason, I think that the government's position that this constitutes, that this meets the definition of a public order emergency is exactly right. I wanted to set my view on the record on why I think that the invocation of the Emergencies Act is quite correct. Let me now deal with some broader issues in the abstract. First of all, freedom and democracy in the Charter. I absolutely agree that these are sacrosanct, that these are values that underpin our democracy. The Charter is in many ways the founding document of Canada, even though it was only introduced in 1982. So many observers have made the quite correct argument, I think, that Canada only really became an independent country in 1982 because that's when the Charter was put in place. This document, as we know, ensures freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association. Without these freedoms, Canadians are not free. They ensure our ability as legislators to discuss and debate the issues of the day. They ensure the ability of our constituents to stand up and either agree or disagree. They ensure the ability of the press to carry out its work. And how tragic it's been to see, how sad it's been to see that that media, that journalists have been treated in the way that they have. And maybe I'll get to that if I have time a little later, Madam Speaker. Crucial, though, to the Charter, and the part that so many forget to pay attention to, is that Section 1 makes clear that there's limits to these freedoms. I quote from Section 1. There's a guarantee of rights and freedoms set out, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrated justified in a free and democratic society. When I hear, for example, my colleagues opposite, especially in the Conservative Party, sadly, talk about how the government has upended the freedom of Canadians, when I hear convoy participants, I won't call them protesters because what they did is not protesting. It's more of an occupation. When I hear that the government has violated the Charter, it becomes difficult to take seriously that they've taken Section 1 seriously. Section 1 makes clear these limits. During COVID, during a pandemic, the government is quite right to introduce vaccine mandates, which, fair enough, could get in the way of some freedom. But there's limits on that. Peaceful assembly as well, Madam Chair, with my last point. Peaceful assembly is not what we saw, and there's a reasonable limit in terms of what we saw with the
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank my colleague for his speech, although I very much disagree, because clearly he's read the Charter, but there are 3 million Canadians whose Charter rights to freely leave and enter the country are being violated by this Liberal government's vaccine mandates, not to mention privacy violations, discrimination of unvaccinated people collecting EI, etc. But that said, he's proposing that the reason this Emergency Measures Act is needed is to remove this blockade in Ottawa, because clearly all of the other things were removed with existing provincial and police resources, although the member from Windsor West said he does need 3 more things, $10 million, a plan to remove barriers, and a safe border task force, all of which can be done without the Emergency Measures Act. So I'm concerned when I see bank accounts being frozen, and then the Minister of Justice saying he's going to expand that to people that have pro-Trump ideas, and the Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister saying she'd like to see those permanently in place. If this is really just about the blockade, will the member rescind this act now that the blockade's...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, with all due respect to my colleague who's just down the road from us in London, and I know and I like her, but I don't know where to begin. There's so many things that were there that are just outright false. One point that I think has caught on among the public, because I've had a number of constituents who have asked this, is the freezing of bank accounts. If there's such a worry that bank accounts will be frozen at will by the government, why is it that only 73 bank accounts have indeed been frozen? There were several thousand people who came down to Ottawa to support the convoy. There have been many donors, but only 73 bank accounts have indeed been frozen. Charter rights have not been suspended here. The Emergencies Act, Madam Speaker, as I said, is subject entirely to the Charter, and I invite my honourable colleague to read the Emergencies Act. Perhaps she has not.
The honourable member for Torres de Blainville. Madam Speaker, I got shivers a bit when I heard what the previous member said, invoking an Emergencies Act, a special law. Well, you can't do that just in case there's an illegal protest. There are already rules in place in every province. When you hear him speak, it makes you think about the Maple Spring in Quebec 10 years ago. Now, Ottawa, with those powers, could have intervened in Quebec in a different way. That's absolutely unconceivable. Does my colleague agree with that?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, my colleague, for her question. I took special care in my speech to emphasize the importance of the Charter. As I said at the outset, the Emergencies Act is subject to it. It is time limited for a period of 30 days. It is geographically focused. If police need those powers, then those powers, those extra powers, are available. But if they do not need to use those extra powers. So I really I don't know where the concern comes from in terms of the Bloc and the Conservatives when they say that there's a threat to freedom and that the government has engaged in overreach here. No, we've heard from police. They needed extra powers in order to push back against what was a clear threat to our democracy. And it looks like in the past few days, success is made in that regard because of the Emergencies Act and its invocation.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank my honourable colleague and my riding neighbour for his speech. I wanted to address a bit of a local issue. Of course, people in London, they know the danger that this kind of right-wing extreme hatred has had. The people of London know it firsthand. In the last few days, we've seen, unfortunately, the raising of Confederate flags in London as well. So I wanted to ask the honourable member what he's heard from his constituents about that, how the government plans to address it, but also if he would be willing to support the NDP private member's bill on the banning of those hate symbols, Bill C-229. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Parliamentary Secretary, 15 seconds.
Thank you to my colleague. Since I only have 15 seconds, I will tell her that I'm quite interested in learning more about the bill. I believe it's been introduced by the member for Burnaby, if I'm not mistaken. And yes, I will look at the details of that. I know it's raised interest in this House. What we saw in London a few days ago in terms of the raising of a Confederate flag, I've been very clear on, completely unacceptable, and we have to be very mindful of the rise of white supremacy and far-right nationalism.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's customary when we start a speech, we say we're honored to stand today, privileged to do so. Well, today is not one of those days. I don't believe anybody is happy about having to stand or sit and speak about the issues we're dealing with. In fact, it's very unfortunate. What I do intend to do today is not...
No.
What others have said.
It's for the page. It's for the page. It's okay.
Please proceed.
I don't intend, Madam Speaker, to repeat what others have said. We've been doing this for 4 days. I'm not going to give free legal advice because in my experience, free legal advice is worth exactly what you pay for it. I am going to speak, however, about the tone of the debate. Now, Madam Speaker, several weeks ago, peaceful protests started across the country. They were in British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and right here in Ontario. People were standing together. People were defending freedom, fighting against oppression. I proudly participated in those rallies with colleagues from both sides of the House of Commons. We even took pictures together, Madam Speaker. But I'm not talking about what happened here in Ottawa or Windsor or Emerson or Coutts. I'm talking about standing side by side with Ukrainian Canadians and my parliamentary colleagues united in defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine. Madam Speaker, those people were fighting for freedom. What happened in Ottawa and Emerson and Coutts and other parts of the country, what happened on these streets in Ottawa, occupying streets and borders, harassing people and breaking the law is not a peaceful protest. The people participating in the protests here could not be more free. They drove across the country. They're free to do so. They're free to stay in Ottawa as long as they want. They're free to leave when they want. They're free to stay where they want. But when they're driving across the country, they weren't free to park in the middle of the Trans-Canada Highway because that is illegal, nor is it peaceful. Until recently, the protesters in Ottawa, with their claim to be fighting for freedom outside this seat of democracy we're sitting in, were making a mockery of the rights of Canadians who take the right to protest seriously. Freedom is not defended by bouncy castles. Freedom's not defended by sitting in a hot tub, and it's certainly not defended by drinking beer in the middle of the street. It's defended by conviction and belief in building a stronger, better society for all and strengthening the fabric of our nation, not destroying it, Madam Speaker. The occupiers here in Ottawa over the last few weeks have hijacked the term freedom, and it's just wrong. In fact, the only freedom impacted by the protests here are other Canadians, the people in Ottawa, where thousands of people can't go to work. They feel unsafe leaving their home. They can't go for a walk with their child. They can't take their dog for a walk. It's ironic and in fact tragic. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I know that some Canadians are frustrated, angry, exhausted. They're tired of everything that's been going on for the last couple of years. Everybody in this chamber today is exhausted. I understand, believe me. COVID-19 has been difficult on everybody. We all want this to end, but Madam Speaker, the real enemy here is not the governments or politicians. It's with the virus itself. We have to remember that. And to the healthcare workers who continue to fight for the lives of Canadians, we haven't forgotten about you in the last few weeks. Thank you again. As time went on, it became clear that this occupation wasn't going to end on its own. The occupiers were free to leave. They had the chance to leave. They chose not to. Peace, order, and good government. It's a phrase we're all familiar with. It's in our Constitution. This debate should be a sharing of ideas on how we move forward together. But sadly, it's become a toxic political debate. When Ottawa declared an emergency, no one was opposed. The situation was the same when Ontario declared a state of emergency. The opposition, the official opposition, has been calling on the federal government to introduce measures as well for weeks. And yet when they do, and we invoke the Emergencies Act, the official opposition opposes the move. Look no further than the Premier of Alberta. 2 weeks ago, he's crying for help. Now he's crying foul. Do we need to wonder why this situation exists? So what does this all mean, Madam Speaker? The Emergencies Act gives police more tools, strengthens their ability to find and imprison, to designate, secure, and protect critical places and infrastructure. It ensures essential services are rendered. It prohibits the use of property to support illegal blockades, and it allows the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offenses when required. There is no army. We are doing what has been asked of us and what needs to be done. Police forces have been using these rules over the past few days. Our forces from across Canada and various levels of jurisdictions came together. They worked seamlessly to de-escalate the occupation of our capital, and they are to be thanked for their professionalism, complete dedication to ensuring the safety of everyone involved. My colleagues have mentioned the change from today outside the House of Commons from days previously. Madam Speaker, I would also like to thank the thousands of truckers and frontline workers who have worked through all of this. The storyline has been distorted as if we stand against truckers. Nobody in this chamber stands against truckers. In fact, it is completely the opposite. They were critical in getting us this far, and we are with them now, as we always have been. I want to give a special thank you to those who work at the Ontario Food Terminal in my riding. We're grateful to you. It has been especially important to recognize your contributions over the last few weeks. The truckers and workers at the food terminal have been working hard and tirelessly to keep goods and services moving for Canadians. It's a critical food hub for Ontario and many other parts of Canada. We depend heavily on imported fruits and vegetables at this time of year. Border disruptions put our supply of perishable food at risk. These disruptions are completely unacceptable. The Emergency Act measures are time-limited, geographically targeted, reasonable, and proportionate to the threats. The Act is only being used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across Canada. People are trying to tie this to the War Measures Act. Let's be crystal clear, Madam Speaker. This is not the War Measures Act. With this act, we are not calling in the military. We are not overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are not limiting freedom of speech or freedom of peaceful assembly. This has been proven over the last few days. Canada is a rule of law country. The authorities have been cautious, careful, professional, respectful, and patient, resulting in peaceful protests leaving the streets of Ottawa. The Emergency Act only applies if you are involved in illegal activity. It is that simple, Madam Speaker. Next, Madam Speaker, I want to address something that has been repeated by the opposition time and time again, that this government should meet with leaders of the protest as if this would make the whole thing go away and solve all these problems. Well, this is nothing more than a distraction, as we all know, because there are no real leaders. This is not a cohesive group that are united in one cause. I have spoken to people on all sides of the issues. I continue to speak with people on all sides of the issues. I do it every day by phone and by email, and yes, in Ottawa. Besides, Madam Speaker, if the Conservatives truly believe that meeting with any one group or one individual that would solve this problem, and that was a real option, they would have done it. Instead, they have random MPs, including their now want-to-be leader, taking pictures with random protesters. And now that aspiring leader is nowhere to be seen, following these selfies and photo ops, which he's for so long criticized others for doing. Madam Speaker, the government's action was about keeping Canadians safe, protecting people's jobs. Let's restore freedom to the people of Ottawa, Windsor, Coutts, Emerson, and British Columbia. And elsewhere, restore confidence in our institutions. Let's restore order together, please. We need to work together. The question isn't what happens if we do this. The real question is what happens if we don't. We need to be the ones fighting to protect our freedoms, not fighting with each other and trying to one-up each other. In the coming days, a parliamentary committee will be struck to provide oversight while this emergency is in effect. Parliament has the ability to revoke the declaration of the emergency as set out clearly in the Act. Madam Speaker, there is no suspension of liberty here. We're trying to give people their liberty back. Peace, order, and good government, it's what we were elected to provide. Let's do it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Regina Levon.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate that story that was just told by the Liberal member trying to perpetuate myths that the Liberals are putting forward. Like, there's no charter infringement. There's nothing going on here. People aren't losing their freedoms. Well, Madam Speaker, they say they needed this act. At Coots, they got rid of the blockades without using the Emergency Act. At Surrey, they got rid of the blockades. At Windsor, they got rid of the blockades. My question is, if he doesn't think that individual Canadians are losing their freedoms, does he believe that 73 bank accounts being frozen by this government is not a loss of freedoms in Canadians' eyes?
Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for that question. Look, this is a very serious issue, and when you break the law, there are very serious consequences. This act, what it does is it gives police and legal authorities across the country to protect you and me and your constituents and my constituents from people who are working behind the scenes, including people who are donating to this cause for the wrong purposes. Rights are protected. It's right in the legislation. This member's party made sure of that when they introduced this piece of legislation. I am a lawyer. I worry all the time about protecting people's rights. I've spent my life fighting for it. I am comfortable with what we are doing here. It's the right thing to do.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Repentigny.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In my colleague's speech, my colleague from Etobicoke Lakeshore, he said at one point that the government had been very patient. I would use a different adjective. I would say incompetent instead. I have another question to explain why it took so long to intervene. Were there some underlying political considerations that would explain the government's inaction? The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for this question. This question sums up the whole problem we've been facing for 2 years. Everybody likes blaming everybody else and taking credit for things they had nothing to do with. I mean, people throughout this camp, this 2-year process have been saying this person moved too fast, this person moved too slow, when what they should have been doing is sitting down with each other and saying, how can we work together to make it right? That's the real issue here. Was there political considerations? Absolutely not. The only consideration here is the safety of Canadians and what are the right steps to do to make sure that they're safe. Full stop.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
And thank you to the member. Change is never easy. I hear Canadians having a difficult time adjusting to a new life of taking extra care to go shopping, to go eat at a restaurant. But these are measures we have to do to protect those who cannot get vaccinated. Does this act prevent everyday Canadians from living their daily lives?
Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
An excellent question. The short answer is no, of course not. It does not affect the people in my community or the communities of anybody in this house today of carrying on with their normal life. People are free to come and go and do what they want. What this does, freedom to protest does not mean parking at the end of my driveway, honking your horn for weeks on end so I can't sleep and prohibiting me from going to work and then peeing on my lawn. This allows people to...
Can I remind the Honourable Member just to be a little more prudent in the usage of language, please? That is not terribly parliamentarian. The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
My apologies. I think the answer stands for itself. I will retract the use of that word and replace it with something more appropriate. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
like to thank the member for his comments and for his approach to it. One of the concerns that I've had through this debate, because this is actually a very serious debate that we're facing, but there seems to be a conflation sometimes between the issues that may have been raised by some of the people who've been involved in these events on bridges, blocking our borders, or here in Ottawa, and the method that they used to raise that, and what the impact has been on things like jobs, trade, and on people's daily lives in a very serious way. So if I could ask the member to comment, does he feel that the issues have been conflated, and what's the impact?
Honourable Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore in 15 seconds or less.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The answer is yes, and I alluded to this earlier in a question. There is a message out there. People have opposing views. I respect those views. But if people who I stand with are suddenly hijacked by people who are doing something wrong and have a message which is inappropriate, we need to walk away and separate those messages so that we can read it.
And we resume debate. The Honourable Member for Lambton Kent Middlesex.
Hear, hear. Speaker, this is a sad and dark time for our great country. The last 2 years have been difficult for everyone. Every single person in this country has been affected by the pandemic. No one has been exempt. How did we get here? What brought us to this point? Standing here in this chamber today to debate the unprecedented use of Canada's Emergencies Act is upsetting, to say the least. The culmination of what has happened to our country under the Liberal government's divisive and stigmatizing leadership is tragic. We've seen peaceful law enforcement resolutions that ended multiple unlawful border blockades without the Emergency Act. So why, Speaker, do we need to escalate to these drastic measures? Speaker, I will always stand up for Canadians' rights to peacefully assemble and lawfully protest. Likewise, I will always condemn disrespectful, hateful, and unlawful conduct. Conservatives have condemned the blocking of critical infrastructure and have called for a peaceful protest. As events evolved, the Prime Minister made no effort to de-escalate the situations. Instead, he escalated it by continuing to divide, wedge, stigmatize, and traumatize Canadians. Instead of apologizing for his mistakes, he threw fuel on the fire and opted for extreme overreach. Canadians have had enough. At the very least, they deserve a plan from the Liberal government to end the mandates. Speaker, it's been said many times this week, the Emergencies Act has never been invoked and should only be used in the most dire situations. It was not invoked for the Oka crisis, not for 9/11, not for the shooting on Parliament Hill, the rail blockades, or even for COVID-19. Where is the threat to our sovereignty and national security? What proof does the government have that the threshold has been met to invoke its use now? The Prime Minister or any of his ministers have not answered these questions. The Prime Minister has said the Act should not be used at first, second, or third choice. But we on the opposition side have asked repeatedly, what then were his first, second, and third choices? And the question has still not been answered. Speaker, the government, which currently has immense powers granted by the Emergencies Act, refuses to be clear or accountable to Parliament. How can they be trusted to show responsibility in answering to Canadians? The situation has become a spectacle around the world, and this is as a result of the Prime Minister's failures. So he tries to save face by using the Emergencies Act, a measure of last resort. It's like using a wrecking ball to fix a broken tractor. It makes no sense. What also doesn't make sense is a February 17th tweet from Foreign Policy Canada, which said, and I quote, "Canada condemns Cuba's harsh sentencing following the July 2021 protests. Canada strongly advocates for freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly free from intimidation. We stand with the people of Cuba and their aspiration for democracy," end quote. Speaker, this is a little rich coming from a government that won't even so much as go out and listen to its own people who have been waiting to be heard. The government claims that they will not use this piece of legislation to take away freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. But we have gotten to a point here where people from all over the country feel that they do not have a voice. We are at a point where the government has dropped a sledgehammer and is taking the most extreme action the government can take to silence the voices of Canadians who are simply asking to be heard. Again, I must ask, what were the first, second, and third things the government did to avoid getting to this place that we are at now? And I'm not alone in wondering why the Liberal government is so hesitant to advocate for the same freedoms for its own citizens as they've asked for Cubans. I know the Prime Minister has said that he admires basic dictatorships. Could it be that they find democratic rights such as free expression and peaceful assembly inconvenient when it doesn't align with their politics? Real leadership involves listening to people and considering their opinions, whether you agree or disagree with them. Real leadership is about making sure people feel heard. The Prime Minister continues to malign and name-call Canadians with whom he disagrees. Speaker, this is not leadership. Real leadership allows people to write your office and say, quote, I appreciate that regardless of someone's perspective on the mandates, you are open-minded and enough to talk to them, end quote. Real leadership is acknowledging and owning your mistakes. It's humility, not hubris. Speaker, if our Prime Minister had at least attempted to listen to the people who came all the way to Ottawa, we would not be in this situation at all. Canadians came to Ottawa from coast to coast to coast. They spent thousands of their hard-earned dollars and time, days of their time, to be here because they felt that their government wasn't listening to them. They felt that the only way they could be heard was by coming to Ottawa. The Prime Minister has done nothing but divide, wedge, stigmatize, and traumatize Canadians for 2 years. Canadians have seen that. Trust has been broken. Conservatives warned Canadians repeatedly about the Liberals' love of power. We have stood against the unprecedented power grabs and scandals since before the pandemic. We said no when they tried to grant themselves unlimited taxing and spending powers without parliamentary oversight. This all happened on a weekend, and Madam Speaker, here we are on a weekend again, debating another piece of emergency legislation that gives the government overreaching power. Speaker, the legislation grants unprecedented powers from Canadians over Canadians' financial security. And I've heard from thousands of residents in Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, most who have never contacted their MP's office. Simply put, they're traumatized. They're gripped with fear that donating to or purchasing from anything not approved by the government will result in their assets being frozen. They have very real concerns of how the changes brought by the Act will impact their finances and their credit ratings long term. They write me saying, quote, my country is falling apart. What do I do? End quote. They are hearing on the news that the Liberals are threatening to freeze their bank account if you support an organization they don't approve of. And that's not exaggerating. During an interview, the Justice Minister even replied in the affirmative when asked if the banks could freeze the accounts of anyone who donated for not liking the government's vaccine mandates. He said, quote, if you are a member of a pro-Trump movement who is donating to this kind of thing, then yes, you ought to be worried, end quote. Well, I would say to the Minister that this is not what we're seeing. It's ordinary Canadians, patriotic Canadians, who are having their accounts frozen. It's Canadians who disagreed with an unnecessary and divisive government policy. It's not people donating large sums of money. It's Canadians who donated $20 or who are being locked out of their bank accounts, those who bought a T-shirt or a toque, and those who sent money to a peaceful demonstration that gave them hope. Speaker, even though the Liberal government says that these financial measures are temporary, regardless of how the vote goes, the Liberals will bring legislation forward to transition these powers into a permanent power grab. They want to permanently remove judges who are the gatekeepers that ensure big government overreach doesn't happen. The Finance Minister said as much during a press conference on Monday, that the move to make crowdfunding platforms reportable to FinTrack is to be made permanent. She is also telling the banks to review the relationship with anyone involved in the blockades and report findings to the RCMP and CSIS. Speaker, Canadians will look back on this debate in the history books, and they will see which of us and the parties we represent stood up for their interests, for their freedoms, and for ending or enabling the continued trauma brought forward by the Prime Minister's inability to show compassion and leadership, and his power-seeking political games. It is the government's responsibility to stop contributing to the problem, but also to significantly improve its response to address the damage that's already done. Speaker, I would like to encourage everyone to open compassionate eyes, hearts, hands, and hands to the burdens our families, neighbours, and communities are bearing, and to create for each other a harbour of safety, respect, and inclusion that we Canadians are known for. Conservatives will continue to stand up for the rights and freedoms of all Canadians. We can do this without the government overreaching and using the Emergencies Act. Canadians are clear when they write our offices to say, quote, "I'm asking that you vote for ending all mandates, as well as the state of emergency immediately. It is time to follow the medical science and not political science and do the right thing for the people," end quote. Speaker, that is why I will be voting against this motion.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Well, I think I can agree with one thing that this member said, and that is that historians will look back on this pivotal moment in time in this chamber, and I imagine some that teach history, political history, will reflect on the fact that by some twisted logic, the Conservative Party that touts itself to be the party of law and order somehow throughout this entire siege of Ottawa and the aftermath of it sided with those who broke the law. Can this member please shed some light on this to this House on how it is that the party of law and order, the party of Brian Mulroney and Flora MacDonald, who brought this legislature into this House, somehow are siding and standing shoulder to shoulder with the occupiers, just not physically in the last few days.
Honourable Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, when we look in history books, when somebody is standing up for freedom for Canadians in the history books, we will never be on the wrong side of history standing up for the freedom of Canadians.
Hear, hear.
And I would encourage the member opposite to stop the divisive rhetoric that I hear constantly day in and day out here and actually show some leadership and be encouraging and try and give Canadians hope, which is what Conservatives are doing every day in this place, and we will continue to do so.
Hear, hear. L'honorable député de Laurentides-la-Belle.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-la-Belle. Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague. She mentioned that we're in a crisis of confidence.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for her question. Speaker, in